Back in the day, if you were black in Los Angeles and wanted a loan to buy a house, open a business, or just build something of your own, you didn't walk into just any bank. You walked into Broadway Federal. This wasn't just a place to stash your paycheck or grab a cashier's check. It was a symbol, a safe haven, a message that said, "You're seen, you matter, and we're going to help you build." Sitting right at Venice and La Brea, with other locations later popping up in places like Market Street in Inglewood, Broadway Federal wasn't trying to compete with the giant banking skyscrapers downtown. It was planted in the neighborhoods that were always told no, and for decades, it said yes when nobody else would. But now those locations are either gone or completely rebranded, and the name Broadway Federal has pretty much vanished, quietly, like it was never there. No big press coverage, no outcry, just gone. And people are still asking the same question: what happened to this bank? Why did it just disappear? To understand how big that question really is, you gotta go back to 1946. That's when H. Claude Hudson, a dentist turned activist, looked around LA and realized something ugly. Black families, returning black GIs, even successful black professionals couldn't get approved for basic loans. It didn't matter if they had stable incomes or perfect payment histories. If you were black, the door stayed shut. White banks saw the neighborhood you lived in, or the church you attended, or the color of your skin, and immediately stamped you high risk. So Hudson decided to build his own door. With support from the black community and other like-minded investors, he founded Broadway Federal Savings and Loan Association. The idea was radical for the time, not because it was flashy, but because it was fair. All this bank wanted to do was treat people with dignity, let them borrow money, pay it back, and build wealth like everybody else. And it worked. Through the 50s and 60s, Broadway Federal became more than just a bank. It became a landmark, a meeting place, a symbol of what black financial power could look like. Families who'd been renting for generations finally got mortgages. Churches that had been holding service in living rooms finally bought real buildings. Entrepreneurs with nothing but a dream and a hustle finally got the seed money they needed. And every time someone walked through those doors, they weren't just doing business. They were building a future. That sense of community, that loyalty, it wasn't something you could fake. People felt like this bank was theirs. And they were right. What makes Broadway Federal's rise even more powerful is that it didn't happen during peaceful times. It stayed standing through some of LA's darkest chapters. When the Watts riots tore through the city in 1965, a lot of businesses boarded up or bailed out. Broadway stayed. When South Central was redlined, starved of investment, and ignored by every major institution, Broadway kept lending. When the crack epidemic in the 80s devastated whole communities, when the LAPD's war on crime tactics made the streets feel like war zones, Broadway didn't close shop. They kept the doors open. And after the Rodney King verdict sparked a 5-day uprising in 1992, many thought the bank might fold under pressure. But Broadway Federal doubled down. They stayed local. They stayed visible. They stayed committed. But by the late 90s and early 2000s, the financial landscape was shifting fast. Mega banks were swallowing up smaller ones. Tech was changing how people banked, and regulations were piling up. Small community banks across the country were struggling just to keep up. Broadway Federal had always been mission-driven, but now it had to be profit-driven too. There were new competitors, stricter federal oversight, and a wave of predatory lenders targeting the very neighborhoods Broadway was trying to protect. In this new environment, survival wasn't guaranteed, and that pressure started to show. Then came the storm. In the mid-2000s, just before the financial crisis, Broadway Federal got caught in something messy. A loan officer and an appraiser working at the bank were found to be inflating property values for church loans, mostly to black churches around LA. These loans were high risk, often tied to aging congregations or declining attendance, and many of them started defaulting. It created a domino effect. The defaults hurt the bank's bottom line. The government started investigating, and eventually, both the loan officer and the appraiser were hit with federal charges. Now, to be fair, Broadway's top executives weren't directly named in the fraud, and the bank's leadership tried to make it clear they weren't in on the scheme. But the damage was done. Public trust was shaken. Regulators started circling. And for the first time in a long time, Broadway Federal wasn't seen as bulletproof. By 2010, things were looking rough. The bank's finances were upside down. The stock price had tanked. The Office of Thrift Supervision issued a cease and desist order, demanding Broadway clean up its books, raise new capital, and get its lending practices in order. That same year, the CEO was forced out, and internally, the institution was going through a complete identity crisis. Was it still a community bank? Or was it now just a barely surviving financial operation clinging to its legacy while trying to stay above water? Either way, it was clear Broadway Federal was in trouble, and while they eventually navigated through the crisis without collapsing entirely, they never really recovered to full strength. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because instead of collapsing, Broadway Federal pivoted, quietly, strategically. In 2021, the bank announced it was merging with City First Bank, a Black-owned bank based in Washington, D.C. On the surface, it looked like a win. This was going to create the largest Black-led minority depository institution in the country, over $1 billion in assets, more reach, more loans, more influence. For advocates of Black banking, this merger was historic. It felt like a necessary move to survive in a world that's increasingly hostile to small banks. But the reality on the ground, especially in LA, felt different. See, after the merger, the name Broadway Federal started to disappear. The signs came down, the website redirected, the local branches slowly rebranded under City First, and the Venice and La Brea location, once a cornerstone for the community, went quiet. No ribbon cutting, no community press release, no real goodbye, just a quiet fade out. And that hit people hard, because to the folks who banked there for decades, who opened savings accounts for their kids or cashed checks from their small businesses, Broadway wasn't just a bank, it was part of the neighborhood's DNA. Now some people might say this is just the way business works, and maybe it is. Banks merge all the time, brands change, names evolve, but when that evolution wipes out history, it's hard not to feel like something was lost. Broadway Federal wasn't just a financial institution. It was a record of Black economic resilience in Los Angeles. It was proof that through redlining, through riots, through decades of disinvestment, the community could still build something solid, something lasting. And maybe it was lasting, just not in the way people hoped, because while the name disappeared, the legacy didn't. The question that still lingers, though, is what that legacy really means in today's LA. Gentrification has changed whole zip codes. Long-time residents have been priced out. Property values are up, but ownership among Black families is down. New banks are moving in, offering shiny digital platforms and national ads, but none of them have roots like Broadway did. And that creates a vacuum, a space where the next generation doesn't remember who gave their grandparents their first mortgage, or who helped rebuild after the uprisings, or who kept showing up when nobody else would. But maybe that's part of what makes this story matter. Maybe it's not about blaming the system or bashing the city. Maybe it's just about remembering what was real, what was built, what actually stood the test of time. Because in a place like LA, where things get torn down and rebuilt every year, memory is power, and Broadway Federal deserves to be remembered, not just as a lost bank, but as a living story of what's possible when a community backs itself. So if you ever find yourself driving past Venice and La Brea, or walking through Market Street in Inglewood, take a second to look around. You might not see the Broadway sign anymore. You might not see the lines of people cashing checks on a Friday afternoon, but the impact is still there, in the homes that were bought, in the churches that were built, in the dreams that got financed when everyone else said, not a chance. That's the kind of legacy you can't erase, even if the name's not on the building anymore.